Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Geoffrey Chaucer lived from around 1340 to 1400. He is considered the father of English poetry. The son of a wine merchant, he served as a page, courtier, diplomat, and civil servant. In 1360, he was captured during the Rheims campaign of the 100 Years' War, but was soon released when Edward III paid his ransom. His contemporary, the poet Thomas Hochlever, hailed him as the first finder of a fair language. Similarly, the poet monk John Lydgate, who completed some of the unfinished Canterbury Tales, called him the lodestar of our language. Chaucer was the first writer to be interred at Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. He translated Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy and The Romance of the Rose. He also wrote a treatise on astronomy. However, his towering achievement was as a poet, and the author of works such as The Parliament of Fowls, The Legend of Good Woman, Troilus and Cressida, and the Canterbury Tales. In this interview, Megan E. Murton discusses Chaucer and his works. Megan E. Murton has been Assistant Professor of English at the Catholic University of America since 2015. She is a medievalist and specializes in the works of Geoffrey Chaucer, with a particular interest in his religious writings and his response to classical literature and philosophy. She is the author of Chaucer's Prayers, Writing Christian and Pagan Devotion, and is currently working on a book that reevaluates the profound influence of Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy on Chaucer. Professor Megan Murton, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start off by talking a little bit about Chaucer's life. Which events in his life are important for understanding his writings?
Well, I think the most important events are really his reading of certain books, is how I would put it. There are other people who would take a more strongly biographical approach to Chaucer, but what I think I love so much about his writings is just a richness of imaginative life and a really complex response to the heritage of literature that he, was exposed to. So I think his reading of certain books is really the most decisive event to understand. I would start with Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy, which is a work that I put on my list of the top 5 books to read, because I think that one, more than any other single book that he read, really helps us unlock a lot of his interests and preoccupations throughout his poetry. So that book, which he seems to have encountered sometime in the 1370s, is a really important moment for him creatively and intellectually. I would add to that his encounter with Dante, also probably in the 1370s. This does link up to his actual literal biography in that he traveled to Italy for work on the king's business, and that's probably how he was exposed to Dante's writings. He was one of the very few English speakers to have read them. He probably had some proficiency in Italian from growing up as the son of a wine merchant in London. So he was able to read and understand Dante, and that had an enormous creative impact on him as well. There are other books, of course, that were important to him. He was constantly reading various French poetry. All of that trickles into his works. But those two encounters with other writers, with other poets specifically, are, I would say, the most important life events for getting at what's really valuable and interesting in his poetry.
Well, you've already mentioned the importance of his meeting with Dante, and he was influenced by the rise of literature in the vernacular under authors such as Dante, Boccaccio. Wherein lies Chaucer's originality when compared to authors such as Dante and Boccaccio?
That's a great question, and it's something that I always get into with my students teaching Chaucer, because they're used to the idea of originality that is sort of a post-romantic idea that we have, where the author needs to sort of dream everything up himself or herself, and that's very much not the medieval notion of originality. Something that just one person came up with in their head would have been regarded as probably really idiosyncratic and uninteresting to anybody else. So what people were looking for in poets was a creative response to what was already out there. So an intervention in a tradition that engaged really profoundly and thoughtfully with what was already there, and then just put a new spin on it, or it took a new angle on something that people already knew. So if you look at his relationship with Boccaccio, for instance, Boccaccio wrote Il Filostrato, which is a love story that forms the basis for Troilus and Cressade. And Chaucer took that work up and fully absorbed it, and replicated in his Troilus and Cressade many specific plot events, indeed some actual lines of dialogue. It's really a very close rendition of the Boccaccio, and yet it also is a complete transformation of it at the same time. He makes changes that might look small, but that have really profound kind of knock-on effects. For instance, the fact that in Boccaccio's version, the man, Troilus, or Troilo in Italian, has loved other women before, and this is just sort of his latest fling. Whereas in the English version, Troilus has never loved anyone. This is his first love, and that kind of the innocence and freshness that he brings to the relationship. It's a small change in one sense, but it also just changes everything. So that's an example of the way in which Chaucer can be original and take an existing story in a radically new direction, while at the same time following a source pretty closely. So his originality, specifically in Troilus and Cressade, I would say, is to take Il Filostrato and make it both more courtly, so more invested in the courtly love tradition and its ideals, and also to make it a lot more philosophical. So he infuses a lot of Boethius into his rendition of the poem, and makes Troilus something of a philosopher lover, as opposed to the much more kind of straightforward, perhaps even a little bit cynical approach to love that we see in Boccaccio. So it's weaving together multiple sources, putting a new spin on a story that's already there. That's what Chaucer's originality looks like. And I've just mentioned that one example, but the same pattern happens over and over again in his works. The story, the basics of the plot are there. He's not really changing that, but he's making all these other changes around it that give it a completely different significance.
As what we call a remake today in cinema.
Yeah, it is like a remake. Yeah, exactly.
And we've compared them to European poets who are beginning to write in the vernacular. How is he different from other English poets of the period, such as William Langland or the Pearl Poet?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question too. I mean, you mentioned vernacularity, and I meant to say something about that, but then I got distracted talking about Boccaccio. But yeah, the fact that Chaucer's writing in English is such an important part of understanding what he's doing. And I always start by telling students that England was a trilingual culture at the time, right? So there was English, which was the lowbrow language, the one that you would order your ale in the pub, right? There was French, which was the highbrow courtly language, the language of sophisticated culture. Chaucer moved in those circles, even though he was not himself an aristocrat, but that was sort of their world. And then thirdly, of course, there was Latin, the language of the church and the university. That's the language of erudition, intellectual ambition, and complex philosophical and theological concepts. So there's all three of these languages in play. And I think what Chaucer does even more effectively than the other English poets of his day is to draw into the English language those other spheres that were typically covered by French and by Latin in his time. So he really creates a courtly register in English and shows that English, despite being this very common lowbrow language, can actually do the sorts of things that courtly literature in French did. It can talk about refined sentiments and feelings. It can go deep into the psychology of love. It has the capacity to do that, he showed, in a work like Troilus and Cressade. And he also showed that it can kind of take over the discursive territory of Latin, and it can deal with complicated ideas, which is not something that people in his day would not look to English as the place to do that kind of thinking. So he kind of conquers, if you like, the territory of the other two languages for English in a way that I think goes beyond what other people do. And that's not to diminish what Langland does. Langland, I don't think, is very interested in the courtly sphere. He definitely is interested in the church as an institution and in sort of reimagining what it can do and what it can be. And so I would say he's more kind of an English-Latin sort of blend. The Gawain poet, or the Pearl poet, is a fascinating example, and I think is the one from the period that most gives Chaucer a run for his money in terms of managing to do all three. But I think what makes him, to me, a little bit less exciting than Chaucer is that he's not so in touch with the continental tradition. So you don't see him responding to someone like Dante, for instance. He has, I think, a slightly more isolated experience just from where he lives in England and from the kind of life he had. And so he can't really be pulling in the main currents of poetic creativity from from Europe in the way that Chaucer can. So I do think he stands out. It's sort of an old-fashioned position. It's not the thing nowadays to say that Chaucer is unique and special. And I think you could push that claim too far and make it sound like he sort of single-handedly invented English literature. I certainly don't want to say that. But I do think there's something special about what he's able to do in terms of enfolding lots of other different areas of expression and thought and poetic creativity into the English language that people at the time wouldn't necessarily have thought was up to the task.
And that seems to be also the assessment of some of his near contemporaries, because there's the poet Thomas Hoccleve, or Hoccleve,
yeah,
calls him
that's right.
the first find of our fair language, and John Lycett,
yes,
the lodestar of our language. So his immediate contemporary seem to be of that view. But from what I recall studying Chaucer in school, he's also, like Shakespeare, a very keen, his characters are very vivid, and he explores psychology. He's up there with the greatest authors in the way he probes psychology. He insinuates ambiguity in his characters, or he has such a rich range of characters. It's not just the language, it's also he's a great dramatist.
Yeah, I love the Shakespeare comparison. I think that's exactly right. And I think that also applies kind of to what I've just been saying about what Chaucer did to enlarge the expressive and intellectual capacities of English. I feel like Shakespeare gets a lot of credit for enlarging the language. I feel like Chaucer probably deserves more, because just in terms of the words that he imported into the language, he definitely outstrips Shakespeare in that regard. So yeah, I think they're similar in terms of what they did for English as a language, and I completely agree with you that they're similar in terms of their attention to character psychology. They're writing in different modes. Chaucer never writes in drama. Shakespeare almost never writes narrative. There are a few examples from early in his career, but he writes for the stage. So they're not writing in the same genres at all, but they manage to achieve really similar levels of complexity in their portrayal of human interaction and motivation.
So what led you to specialize in Chaucer?
Well, it was a class I took, as is so often the case. So I took my freshman year in college, I took a medieval literature class just to fulfill my general education requirements, and just loved it, was really carried away by it. We didn't read a word of Chaucer in that class, but it introduced me to the courtly tradition in French, particularly. I ended up becoming a French major and taking more medieval courses in the French department. But then my junior year, I thought, well, let's branch out and try Chaucer. There was a graduate level class in Chaucer that I was allowed to enter, and that really carried me away. I think the French background was wonderful for Chaucer because, like I said, he's really steeped in those traditions. So there were a lot of things that I felt like were easy for me to understand and take on board right away from his writings. But it was just exciting to bring all the things that interested me about medieval literature and to see them playing out in my own language, especially to see my own language kind of growing and changing in Chaucer's hands. I was also, in addition to a French major, I was a linguistics major. So the interest in language is really part of what pulled me into Chaucer in the first place. So from that class onwards, it was clear that Chaucer was where I wanted to be. And so I switched into English for my graduate training. And now I get to teach Chaucer almost every semester, which is wonderful.
Great. And you've explored Chaucer's credentials as a Christian writer in Chaucer's Prayers, writing Christian and pagan devotion. What's the main argument of your book?
The main argument is that when we encounter a prayer in one of Chaucer's poems, we should approach it as a script for us to perform rather than just some words on the page for us to read. And this argument is based on the observation that prayer in Chaucer's culture was very much a scripted activity. The idea of praying extemporaneously and self-expressively was totally unknown in his world. So that prayer is scripted, prayer is written, and thus that follows that those written prayers are not just text in the ordinary sense of the term. They are something you're supposed to I say perform, but I don't mean any aspect of fakeness about it, right? You're supposed to inhabit it. You're supposed to make that your own as you recite it. If you add to this the fact that poetry was always read aloud in Chaucer's world, it was still idiosyncratic to read silently in your heads, the sort of thing that people comment on, my friend weirdly reads without making any noise, right? That tells you that people are used to vocalizing when they read. So if you combine this cultural practice of scripted prayer with the cultural practice of reading out loud whenever you read, it's easy to see how if you're reading a poem out loud to yourself or to a group of friends and you come upon a prayer, that's a really powerful and distinctive moment in your reading. You are, in a sense, performing and inhabiting that prayer in the act of reading it. And I think we need to take seriously what that looks like across Chaucer's corpus. Now, there are some places where the prayers are Christian, and given, you know, the Christian identity of Chaucer's immediate audience, those prayers are really available for them to inhabit and use for their own personal devotion. And I think we need to take seriously the possibility that they did that when they were reading Chaucer, which is not something people have really considered. Then a bunch of the prayers written in works like Troilus and Crusade that we've talked about, and then several others that have pagan settings, we get prayers to pagan deities. And I think it's really interesting to consider the imaginative demands that those place on the audience. I'm certainly not suggesting that Chaucer wants people to actually pray to, you know, to Mars or to Venus or whatever. But I think it's interesting that he's asking people to imagine their way into pagan religious practice and to sort of see what it feels like to pray in that way. His pagan prayers do set up a certain relationship to the pagan deity that I think is interestingly different from the kind of relational dynamic that we see in his Christian prayers. So I think he's interested in exploring religious difference and inviting his readers to kind of imagine their way into it. So the prayers are doing different things based on whether they're Christian prayers or whether they're pagan prayers, but the common thread is that a prayer is a space that you step inside in a poem. It's not just words on the page like other words. And so what Chaucer does with that invitation is what I'm interested in.
And you've recommended two works of Chaucer in particular, Troilus and Cressida, and the Canterbury Tales.
Yes.
Are there any particular edition of these works or of Chaucer's works in general that you would recommend?
I'm so glad you asked, because I actually made sure that I had within arm's reach my Norton Chaucer.
Okay.
This is a new edition. Yeah, complete works. So it does have some things that I did not regard as important to include in the top 5, but interested readers might be glad to have them there. Yeah, and what's nice about it is that it is much more kind of slimline and portable than the old complete works edition, which is called the Riverside Chaucer, which I also have in arm's reach, but it's so enormous and difficult to pull over here that I don't think I'll heft it up. But it's very, very scholarly. Almost half of it is explanatory and textual notes. It has a lot more than most people need, whereas the Norton Chaucer has what you would need, has really good glossing and explanation of the Middle English to help people through that, because I really think any modern English reader with a bit of patience can figure out Middle English easily enough with a decent edition. So that's the one that I would recommend.
But you've mentioned how some might find Middle English a little too daunting. Would there be any translations of Chaucer's main works that you would recommend?
Well, what I like is actually available for free online, and it's the Harvard Chaucer website has an interlinear translation. So you're still seeing the Middle English, but you're seeing modern English line by line. That I think is the best way, and also a really good kind of soft entry into reading Middle English. If you can just kind of go along with the interlinear version, you might eventually find that you can outgrow it. So that's, unfortunately, it's only of the Canterbury Tales, but the Harvard Chaucer website has that for free online, and I think it's quite a good resource.
Let's go to the first work you've recommended, Troilus and Cressida.
Yes.
Some consider this Chaucer's finest poem. Do you agree?
I do, actually. I think it's a masterful achievement. I think it has so much going for it on a number of different levels. Just the form, the fact that he invented a stanza form for this poem called Rhyme Royal, which very beautifully kind of structures the work and gives it this very stately, glorious pace as you go through it. Each, it's measured out into these little stanzas, like tiny little chapters. So that's one thing it has going for it. But what I really love about it is I think it is just a very searching exploration of what it means to love someone. I think Troilus, the hero, is a very philosophically and theologically inclined person. And so when he falls in love for the first time, he doesn't just think about his desire and achieving it. He also thinks about what it means and what love is ontologically. That's the first question he asks. What am I feeling? What is this exactly? So he's really interested in sounding the depths of this experience, and he does that in very powerful ways that draw on Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. So he ends up linking his love for Crusade, so this this personal feeling, this passionate feeling, to the love that orders the cosmos, because even though he's a pagan, he has this conception of cosmic love governing all things and kind of binding the world in beautiful harmony and order. So he really goes interesting theological and philosophical places with the love. And then that all happens by the end of book 3, which is the midpoint of the book. And then the last 2 books show the love falling apart, which I think is really interesting as well, because Chaucer knew that it had to end that way. Like we've already said, he picked the plot up from somebody else, and he couldn't just change that. It would be like changing Romeo and Juliet so they don't die at the end. Like it really has to end in heartbreak and betrayal and loss. And the fact that Chaucer chose to idealize the love so much across the first 3 books and show it to be such a source of philosophical and theological meaning and insight for Troilus, that's just a really interesting creative choice in a book that you know is going to have to end with Troilus getting abandoned and dying alone and sad. And I think what's going on there is a really interesting exploration of the tension between everything that love can be and can mean to us, and just how powerful an experience and even transcendent an experience it can be, and then the inevitability of human frailty and failure and loss and changeability as an aspect of this world that you can't leave behind. It's investigating the kind of power and reach and scope of love, but also keeping that in tension with the fact that things change and this world is unreliable and contingency is real. I think it's a very powerful exploration of those 2 things: everything we aspire to and hope for as human beings, and then also all the things that prevent us from fully realizing what we can imagine. So it's a wonderful exploration of love in that sense, not just romantically, but philosophically, theologically, and then love particularly as kind of part of this bigger picture of what it is to be human and to live in a world that is fallen. I think it really touches on all of those fascinating questions in a really thoughtful way.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.